Hello, this is Jonathan Wilson. We just want to thank you for listening to Libero and to let you know that there is a way you can help us if that's the sort of thing you might. This has been written by Rory. I can tell this has been written by Rory. It's far too polite. Anyway, Rory is making us read this out before episodes. You probably gathered that last week. Rory's from Yorkshire. He's very interested in money. Apparently, this will help us make money, so that's a good thing. But yeah, please help us out anyway. How does it go on? Yeah, we started making this podcast because there weren't enough podcasts. I think that's the thing about me saying there's not enough podcasts about football. Do listen to my other one. It was what it was. We don't ask you to get involved early doors. Started making because we like talking to each other about football. Well, I suppose so. Like the industry working. I'm not sure. I mean, that's what he's talking about. He's got a new job, hasn't he? He's all enthusiastic. We want an excuse to do it more. We've really enjoyed doing it, sort of. Encouraging. Yeah, it is encouraging. So many of you seem to enjoy it. That's actually genuinely been true. We've had lots of emails, more than I expected. Because we're not owned, but I can't read that out because part of me is owned by one of the two Garys. They are titans. He's definitely is a titan of the sports podcast world. Yeah, just sort of rate us, review us, recommend us. In fact, if you're on the bus or maybe on a light transport system, maybe on the train. I'm not saying tube, but I've only seen London Centric. You might be on the metro in Newcastle or Sunderland, for instance, or the tram in Leeds. Why don't you turn to the person next to you and say, I am listening to a great, great podcast. It's called Libero. Please listen. And something here about algorithms, and apparently it's good for the algorithm, which is good for us if you can review us on Google. So if you could do that, that would be brilliant. Anyway, should we get on with it? As I said, I'm Jonathan Wilson. I'm with Miguel Delaney from The Independent. I'm with Jack Pitt-Brooke from The Athletic. And we're all on our way to Bilbao, aren't we, for the Europa League final?
Speaking of public transport.
Speaking of public transport, Jack, you're taking a ferry. What's that about?
Yeah, I hope that I imagine that when this podcast is released, I will be somewhere over. I don't even know what the right preposition is. In and around the Bay of Biscay. On my way, I'm taking the Brittany ferry from Portsmouth to Bilbao, leaving on Sunday evening, arriving on Tuesday morning. I don't actually know why I'm doing this, but I think it kind of occurred to me when Spurs were at some point around the quarterfinals. Wouldn't it be fun to get a ferry to Bilbao? Wouldn't that be? And now it's occurred to me, like, I'm spending 36 hours doing something which I could do in 2 hours. Yeah. And I'm just going to be cooped up on a big, creaky old metal ship, making my very, very slow way to Bilbao. I'll probably feel exhausted, tired and sick and a bit lost by the time I actually get there and have to cover the game.
On the other hand, you get to look. I mean, I presume you've got your own cabin, have you?
I have got my own cabin with 4 beds. So there's any Libero listeners out there who are because if you don't get a cabin on one of these ferries, you have to get like kind of a reclining chair, which is, I know from experience is impossible to sleep on. And so there's any Libero listeners who want an actual bed, just let me know.
I mean, it's going to be too late, isn't it? They're going to have to literally parachute onto the boat if they want to sleep in a bed.
Of course. Yeah,
You will be in transit, actually, as this is released.
But that means you get 36 hours of your own time to sit and read and think, and no Wi-Fi.
No Slack, no parenting, no...
Is there no Wi-Fi on the... Surely there's Wi-Fi on the ferry.
I imagine there'd be a little bit. I can sit there... I can sit there, look at the sea, and write the greatest match preview ever written, and file it the minute that I get to Bilbao.
So should we do our prep for that match preview by talking about the game? This is in some ways sort of a sickening game. It shouldn't be happening to the giants of English football who failed consistently playing off for place in the Champions League final. And yet, I have to say that after Liverpool fans... turn off your headphones for 5 seconds here. After an anticlimactic end to the season, after it's been obvious from sort of January who was going to win the title, who was going to get relegated, it sort of feels like... Well, I'd say this is the biggest game between two Premier League sides this year, right?
Yeah. It's the biggest game of the season. I think it's even bigger than Arsenal PSG, certainly from an English perspective. I mean...
There's a game between two Premier League teams. I think it's bigger than, say, City v Arsenal before Christmas. Miguel?
Yeah, it probably is. I mean, again, and this touches on it because it was something we spoke about in the pod last week. It's just because of the reward for the potential winner, the meaning going forward, and again, this financialization of football. It's exactly the same as the FA Cup final in terms of it feels like the glory of this is less true for Spurs, to be fair, but the glory of the Europa League or the old UEFA Cup feels secondary to what it means for the future of the clubs and the ability to compete in the Champions League. And to be fair, I wouldn't quite say that's true for Spurs, but of course the whole Spurs thing has been overtaken by something very directly related to the Premier League, which is Postecoglou's performance in it.
But I mean, this is the fascinating point about it, isn't it, Jack? You know, Spurs are this team who've won one competition this century. 2008, last time they won something. There's this desperate yearning for success. And yet, every chance Postecoglou becomes the third Spurs manager, the last three Spurs managers to win a major semi-final, has been sacked within 6 months.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I think from a Tottenham perspective, this season feels like a kind of thought experiment come real. Like people, it's the ultimate fan pub discussion at the start of any season. Would you take 17th in a trophy? And people always say, yeah, of course I would. 17th in a trophy. Much better than just finishing 4th or 5th all the time. And this is the season that has come real. Like that's been put to the test. So from a league perspective, it's one of their worst ever league seasons. I think you have to go back to 1912-13 under Peter McWilliam, just before the First World War, when they lost 20 out of 38 games. To go to a season where they've lost 21 or 22 league games, you have to look at one of those seasons, like, for example, in the 50s or 70s, where it was a 42-game season. So there's obviously a bigger sample size. So yeah, it's been a historically bad league season for Tottenham, but they're in their first European final for 6 years. I think it's a big debate amongst fans how these two things ought to be measured. You know, everybody's got their own view on whether the glory of the European run outweighs the shame, if that's the right word, for the league form or not. But clearly it's, I mean, the European achievement, I think, is a big deal in itself. But for a lot of people, it comes to this question, like, how much, for some people certainly, it comes to the question, how much does this mean in a season in which you can argue the team has been, for the most part, disastrously bad?
I mean, I guess if you want to make a defence of Postecoglou, you say Peter McWilliam was a bona fide genius, right? I mean, Peter McWilliam is huge in the development of the Spurs. That, yeah, he sort of helps establish a push and run style. He's massively important in the development of Arthur Rowe, of Vic Buckingham, of Bill Nicholson. So really all the success, the Tottenham glory years of the 60s and 70s come thanks to Peter McWilliam. So yeah,
and it's a good job they stuck with him because he clung on to win the 1921 FA Cup.
Yeah, so I mean, Postecoglou should be saying that to the press. Give me 8 years, I'll win you the FA Cup. Give me 60 years, and you will not believe what this club will have achieved. But I mean, Miguel, how do you look at Postecoglou this season? And I mean, because it strikes me that actually the away games against Werder Glimt and against Frankfurt, they've actually played really well, but they haven't really played in the Postecoglou style. So
No.
this, that's the way we do it, mate. Well, yeah, but when you stop doing it that way, you look a lot better.
This is going to sound harsh, especially for that strand of Australian naturally, and a little bit more oddly American social media user who supports Spurs and is an ardent defender.
Can I just stop you there? 5% of our listeners are in America, Miguel. So just be careful what you're about to say.
But it's more so just a correlation between those who ardently defend Postecoglou and the proportion to come are American Spurs fan. It's actually difficult not to notice. But there's almost been an element of Pyrrhic victory about it, at least I would say as regards Postecoglou's legacy. I mean, obviously, like winning the trophy, again, we spoke about in the last part about kind of just the history, going down in history that you have this achievement, and that will always stand to Postecoglou's record. But in terms of his career right now, I mean, this is a guy who's been sold, or he's sold himself as an ideological purist about playing football in a certain way, about winning in a certain way. Very early on in his time at Tottenham, he actually said that what this is all about is building something sustainable, not just one-off victories that are repeatable. And what this Europa are not necessarily repeatable. And what this Europa League run is basically, it's. I was actually thinking about it when I was researching this for my own preview. There's an element of a Jose Mourinho run about it, and how in every single round he's tailored his team to the opposition in a way that we haven't really seen Postecoglou do. And it's almost like because of everything this represents to, his own promise about winning a trophy every second year, to kind of obviously what it could have meant for his job, although the thinking is obviously that he's about to go. He's abandoned all of that and just like, right, we do this we get through every round by any means necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mourinho is a really good comparison. I did feel like I was watching a Mourinho team when I watched those two Tottenham games against Bodo Glimt, like in the semi-finals, both of which I attended. Like, I think what a lot of teams have found against Bodo Glimt from over the last 3 or 4 years, like teams with far more resources than them, is that because of the way is that they basically fail to build a platform to allow their individual superiority to show. Whereas when Tottenham played against Bodo Glimt, it was like the polar opposite from what we've seen from Spurs under Postecoglou so far. They realised they realised their own strengths, which was basically the physical capacity of their attacking players. They realised the weaknesses of Bodo Glimt, which is that they're very kind of technically good and they're well organised, but they don't really have that physical edge. And so Spurs built a simple system to allow their strengths to tell. They played a 4-2-3-1. Bentancur and Bassouma sat in front of the defence. Charlison back into the team. You got Richarlison and Solanke up front alongside each other with Johnson out on the right. You just hit the ball long to Solanke and Richarlison and Bodo Glimt wouldn't be able to cope. And they won 5-1 over the course of 2 legs. 4-goal margin didn't really tell the whole story. Like, Spurs were so much better in those 2 games. But again, it felt to an extent like you were watching, it did feel a little bit like Mourinho, but certainly just like a kind of a generic or a good, intelligent Premier League team making the most of their massive resource advantage over the opposition. Yeah. And that was so...
it was like, I thought this when we were talking about it the other day. It was like Mourinho's United beating a very, very young Ajax in the 2017 Champions League final. And Mourinho actually subsequently did a seminar on how he beat them. And it was essentially just not playing through your greater ideology, which is what Postecoglou was sold on. But in that United case, it was basically just almost using your greater resources to pummel a lesser resource team where you could in a very rudimentary way.
Mourinho always used to say... Why do you not do this in the Premier League, though?
Well, that's a really good question. So I actually think it wouldn't... I don't think that playing like this would necessarily work in the Premier League, in the sense that there is... the advantages of their playing squad are not quite as pronounced in the Premier League. Like, they've got some players who are really good Premier League players, like Van der Ven when he's fit, Maddison when he's fit, Romero when he's fit, Porro when he's fit. But I don't think they massively stand out. Like, I mean, with the possible exception of the centre-backs, compared to other Premier League teams. Like, Tottenham's wage bill has been cut in recent years, and they're now, I think, based on last year's figures, they're the 7th biggest payers in the Premier League. I think in this season's figures, that might actually wind up being 8th. We don't know yet. So I don't think they can lean on the superiority of their individual players in the league in the same way. I think in the league you need something a bit different, right? You need a more coordinated style of play. So I don't think they could take their Europa League approach into next season's Premier League, for example.
I mean, on what has basically like the paradigm been the last decade? Well, like, how do you build a progressive, potentially successful team at the elite level of football? Where you in most cases actually decide on an ideology and bring in managers that suit that ideology. And as a club like Brighton have shown, say, you evolve, and Liverpool as well, actually, you evolve that ideology as is necessary, but it's still kind of feeding into something greater that amplifies the kind of the pure resource of the team or amplifies individual players. And again, like that's what Postecoglou, I suppose. Well, in this case, Spurs didn't actually settle an ideology. They basically brought in a manager who had an ideology. But the Europa League run doesn't provide any argument that can be the case for the future, which is why we could be in this absurd situation where, unless they do a Ten Hag, which right now everyone is saying isn't going to happen, that he's going to go regardless. But that we're in the situation where Spurs are not just get rid of a trophy-winning manager within 6 months, but likely get rid of them immediately. But of course, there is another side to that, which is maybe, I'll be interested to see what you think about this, Jack, that Postecoglou himself could resign.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if they win, I think it's not going to get any better than this. It's not going to... I don't think their prospects for next season are especially rosy. So it might well be that he thinks that would be the right time for him to go. I would still, at the moment, I would be very surprised if he's the manager beyond 2 weeks' time. I mean, I don't think he'll be the manager for the start of next season. But as we saw with Ten Hag last season, things can change. Like people
Yeah.
who run football clubs do make reactive decisions. I think the one thing that I think is also worth bearing in mind in terms, even if they win. I mean, if they lose, I don't think there's any prospect of him being the manager next season. But even if they win the final, that means that, of course, they'll be in the Champions League. And the one thing we've seen with Spurs, I think, under Postecoglou is that, and this is not just down to him, I think it's also down to the thin squad, but they're not good at balancing domestic and European competition. Like last year they came fifth. They only played 41 games last season. They weren't in Europe. It's obviously easier to do that, and they still had a bit of an injury crisis. This season they found it completely impossible to balance Europe and domestic. Next season, if they're in the Champions League, it will be even harder because you obviously have to try harder in Champions League games than you do in Europa League games. Now, unless they're going to go and spend 500 million quid on players this summer, which I don't think they will, it's going to be very difficult balancing that next season. And I think it's legitimate to say that based on what we've seen of Postecoglou the last 2 seasons, I wouldn't actually back him to balance Premier League and Champions League successfully next season, whether they win the Europa League or not.
And to what extent do you think the Champions League makes a difference in terms of spending? I mean, is Levy just going to go, right, all that money go on new players, or will he remain as sort of financially cautious as he has historically been?
I'd say it's probably the difference between a very modest summer and a slightly bigger summer. You know, Levy produced a short statement in a month or so ago to accompany the publication of last season's accounts, where he basically admitted that there's not a huge amount of money to throw around at the moment. They can only spend what they generate. And even though, you know, the stadium generates a lot of income, which is kind of de-risked in the sense that, you know, Beyonce will play whether or not you're in the Champions League or not. Like they do need that champion.
I would love it if that was a clause in the contract. Beyonce go, I am not playing in the Europa League stadium. I'm too big for that.
They do, you know, obviously they need that Champions League money. And if you're in a stadium like Tottenham where you make so much money on match day, then the prospect of having those guaranteed minimum 4 home games in the Champions League phase, if they're there, that's a huge amount of cash. They need cash. So I do think it will make a big difference to what they can do. Although frankly, it's also worth remembering here that I don't think fees are not just the issue with Spurs. I think a lot of it comes down to salaries. Like they have been a bit more aggressive with fees in the last 5 years, but they're becoming less aggressive in relative terms of salaries. And I think that's what's having an impact on the team.
And assuming Postecoglou does leave, where does he? What's his reputation? Where does he go next? Has he impressed people at all in the Premier League? I mean, yeah, I know that losing 20 plus games in the Premier League is historically bad. You also have to slightly contextualise that by saying that both Spurs and United have basically switched off in the league. The Europa League is clearly there, and they've won 2 out of the last 18 games between them. So would Postecoglou be at all an attractive proposition for a mid-table Premier League team? Or
I think it's a really interesting debate, which is, given that Postecoglou is explicitly, or not explicitly, but given that Postecoglou is clearly prioritising the Europa League, to what extent should he be held accountable for the failures of the Premier League form? I think ultimately he will have to be held accountable for the failures of the Premier League form. But I do think that if they win the Europa League, I think his legacy and his employability will be really good. I kind of sense that Postecoglou knows this as well. Like, he's been talking a lot in the last few weeks about how, you know, when he came in, he was given a remit to sort of revitalise the squad, to bring in younger players. Obviously, Harry Kane had to go as soon as he showed up. It sounds to me as if he's kind of laying the groundwork to, you know, for pitches to be made for future job applications. And clearly he knows the historical import that winning the Europa League would have. I don't really know what his next job would be. I think Spurs' league record this season would count against him if it came to another Premier League job. My sense is, I mean, one thing we know about Postecoglou is he's not afraid to go and work anywhere. You know, he's worked in Japan. He's obviously started off in Australia. He worked briefly in Greece. I think that he would have I don't think there'd be any issue with him taking an interesting job elsewhere in the globe. But clearly his CV would look far, far better with that European trophy on it.
Stylistically, he sort of feels maybe a fit for the Bundesliga. Is that fair?
I think his football. This is kind of one of the challenges of Postecoglou. there's an argument that his football is best suited to a team with a bit of a resource advantage in the league.
Which
If
is
you're
hardly
at-
management at all, though. That's
if
the
you're
problem
at
with
Celtic
that.
or Yokohama, maybe, and maybe this is unfair, but it might be, and I don't actually think this is necessarily true of, say, Brisbane Roar, for example, who I don't think were stronger. But I think that in an environment like the Premier League, which is so competitive, it might be a bit harder. So I mean, I genuinely don't know. I'm just sort of speculating here. But
Miguel,
I
have
wouldn't
you
be.
any thoughts where Postecoglou may end up?
I mean, it's interesting actually in the trajectory of his career. I mean, like, again, most of football history, Celtic, Tottenham would have felt quite a natural jump. In the last few years, there's actually an argument that maybe he made too big a leap. Now, we've said on the podcast before, actually, that even if this doesn't work out, the logic of Tottenham making a move like this, I think, is correct. To look for, I know Postecoglou is a bit older, but he still would have been considered, in terms of his career trajectory, a manager on the rise. And it was right to do that, even if it hasn't worked out. But I do wonder for him himself, whether, because remember, like before he took over at Tottenham, there was talk that Brighton wanted him, and that would have felt a good move if you're going to get into the Premier League and then maybe make the next jump after that. Whereas now, it certainly doesn't feel like he'd have options in Premier League. I think, unless say would West Ham, if somehow something went wrong with Potter, it does feel a bit of a West Ham move to suddenly go for Postecoglou. But like, there's a lot of Premier League clubs who would look at that league form and think no, and because it's not just a league form, I think it's the manner or the way that's resulting in this league form. Because let's be fair, this was already happening before they singularly focused on Europe in the way they have, and obviously that's accentuated it. But it was a problem that existed before that as well, and really, it actually goes back into last season. I actually think it's a little bit of it was generally a good first season, Postecoglou, but I think so much of that was conditioned by the first 10 games. And his record since then has actually been really poor. And given Villa had European football themselves last season, and although, to be fair, their wage bill is a bit higher than Spurs is now, and Villa have obviously have a calculated strategy there, I thought it was a little bit of an indictment to Spurs last year to not finish in the top four and lose that Champions League place to Villa. And that shows that there are longer running issues here than just focusing on the Europa League. And I think it's why I just couldn't see a Premier League job at the moment.
I think there's a view out there which is that everything was rosy before Van Romero got injured, and I don't think that's true. I think that the way they finished last season, even the way they started this season, was at times very good, but also at times pretty bad. And I think that while injuries have totally dominated Postecoglou's time at Spurs, and we've seen this obviously the build up to the final, he's lost his three most talented midfielders, Maddison, Kulusevski, Bergvall, all within the last 2 weeks. I think that I think it's probably too simplistic to say that injuries alone are cause of problems, and that Postecoglou was basically doing fine until the players started getting injured. I think that there were reasons to be anxious, put it like that, beforehand.
And also, we're at a point in football history now where you can't just write injuries off as a bad luck thing anymore. They're part of basically how a club is run and how a manager fits into that. And no, like I've actually had Spurs fans comment on this, including some of those Spurs fans I was talking about. That I wrote a piece on Arsenal last week, and I pointed to the injuries as to why Arsenal feel this has been a generally decent season, despite how it's gone. But within that, there is, I did write as well, Arteta he absolutely has to look at why Liverpool were able to keep their best players on the pitch in the way that Arsenal weren't. And the exact same applies to Postecoglou and Spurs here. And actually, and we'll get onto them, United and Amorim. Like this is a really important part of how football is evolving, especially given how much the game is dependent on pressing.
Well, let's move on then to United and Amorim. We've sort of said that we think whatever happens in this final, the likelihood is that Postecoglou will leave. Are we saying the opposite for Amorim, that whatever happens this final, the likelihood is that he stays, Miguel?
It's funny, actually, just in the last few days, and it's felt like it's come out of the defeat to West Ham, it's suddenly bubbled up a little bit that his future isn't as certain as it would have been considered even a week ago. Part of that is because of Amorim's own comments, but he's since rolled back on that. But part of that is also because of reports that United will review the season. Now, look, it should be stressed that those reviews are and they happen all the time. They're just part of the course. But I suppose the different dynamic is Ratcliffe, I suppose, and for all of United's wider structure, or as Dion Fanning once had the phrase about the Politburo, it's still every decision of that club still ultimately comes down to Ratcliffe. Now he very instinctively saw Amorim as his man from the start. But from everything you hear about Ratcliffe, he is a sort of character as well who can suddenly do abrupt U-turns. I really don't think that's going to happen. I think they will. They have acknowledged just the state the club has been in this year, but it still just feed into an extra dynamic around this final. It's playing. Everyone is sort of playing for their futures in some way, rather than as opposed to just playing for the Europa League.
Do you guys think it would be right for Amorim to keep his job, whatever happens?
I mean, I sort of think that I instinctively like him. He's personable, he's charismatic, he's remarkably humble, I think, in some ways. He's humble in what he says, not afraid to admit things have been abysmal. I guess there's a level of arrogance there of, well, we're playing my way, and I'm not flexible on that. And also the sort of underlying insistence that he is the person who can sort this out. So I just sort of think it's so bad, you have to give somebody a bit of time. And I've used this analogy before, but I think it remains apt, that it is like sending Hercules into the Aegean stables and then popping back your head back in 10 minutes later and going, still looks a bit dirty, Hercules. It doesn't matter if he's Hercules or just a bloke. It's going to take him ages to clean it up. And maybe this is what the cleaning up process looks like. And I think... I don't know, I was going to say the performances in Europe have shown signs of progress, but I'm not even sure that's true. The Lyon performance was so bonkers that...
But do you not think, to some extent, that, to build on your analogy, the cleaning process is going to be worse under Amorim than it would be for a different manager? Because he needs players to play a system. Like, I know that when Liverpool were thinking about replacements for Jurgen Klopp in 2024... they thought about Amorim, but I believe that they thought, well, he's very, very good, but if you want to recalibrate the squad towards playing 3-4-3, you need to spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds just to get to day one, basically. And clearly Manchester United did not reach that same conclusion, but you look at the squad now and you think, this is a bad squad for any manager, and it's especially a bad squad for a team that wants to play 3-4-3, and they are leaving themselves with they have to do so much to get to the point of even being like close to the conversation for like top five, that I wonder whether there might not be a shorter cut with a different manager.
But that's a question for United's strategy rather than a question for Amorim, I would say.
True, but if you had a different manager, you could have a simpler strategy.
Oh, true, yeah. But I suppose, I mean, the way to look at it in terms of whether you sack him and all that, I suppose, and I do take that, and there is an argument that Amorim himself should have adapted in some way, but like, I mean, they know what they're getting, like, basically. This is the way he is. And you've seen the potential reward, say, with what Sporting did to Manchester City, or what, like, in the way he restored Sporting in that way. I suppose the way I would look at it is, if Amorim left after this final, would the Manchester United job affect his career in any way? I think any smart sporting director, any smart club, they'd look at that and they'd look at it the way clubs used to see the Chelsea job or the Paris Saint-Germain job, that the clubs are so distinctive, if you want to give it a generous phrase or a generous description, that it doesn't reflect, it doesn't say anything about the manager while they're in the job. And say Pochettino was the same while he was at PSG.
I mean, I broadly agree with that. The one thing I'd add to that is, if you're a sporting director with any sort of understanding of football, you'd be going, right, this doesn't damage him, but equally, I'm looking at my squad, I'm looking at how he plays. Are these two things going to go together? Because he is clearly not going to change at all. And that, I think, is what makes it so extraordinary at United, that you look at that squad and, I mean, Amad Diallo suits the 3-4-2-1. Mason Mount probably does. Bruno Fernandes just about. Any Yoro maybe. There's not very many others who sort of fit that. So, and I guess maybe the clear out was necessary, and this just sort of hastens the clear out on its way. But you have had a lot of players playing in systems that just don't suit them. And I think one of the most striking things about the the Europa League run, and this maybe touched on something we'll come to in the second half about what does it say about the Europa League, what does it say about the nature of the Premier League in relation to the rest of Europe. The Casemiro, who's been so exposed in the Premier League, trying to play in a central midfield too, just doesn't have the legs to do it anymore. Great player that he was. Suddenly in Europa League, he looks a good player again because the pace is so much slower.
It feels to me sometimes watching Man United as if, I mean, the most striking thing to me I don't watch a huge amount of United, but the most striking thing to me when I watch United in the last few years is how poor they are physically compared to like all the other, and that's been true ever, basically from the start of Ten Hag, like compared to all the seriously good Premier League teams who can just run and run and run for 90 minutes. And if you've got kind of Casemiro, Eriksen and so on in the middle of the pitch, like you're never really going to be able to compete in that way. And yet, I've only realised this season that it looks as if they've just built a squad to play in the Europa League. They bought all these players as if they were like, and this is our grand plan is we're never going to get anywhere in the Premier League with these guys. But if you give Casemiro, Eriksen, Maguire, Xerxes, and so on, those extra 2 seconds on the ball, they're really going to be able to hurt teams. And so maybe this is the first ever kind of bespoke Europa League squad recruitment we've ever seen.
And Maguire can do that on the right wing. He can do it at centre forward. Doesn't even have to play centre back. Just give him time. Maguire can do anything.
I think there's a deeper and more important point in all this. That is one of the reasons why this is possibly the most desperate game of football ever played. Which is, so what you said there about how it's built for the Europa League and how Casemiro he's been much better in the Europa League than the Premier League. Well, what's one big reason for that? One of the major changes this season has been Champions League clubs haven't dropped down to the Europa League. And that wasn't just a decision taken from just the expansion of the Champions League. I was speaking to people during the week about this, people who work on kind of where these decisions are made. And they're saying that all of the decisions that were taken in European football from 2019 through to 2022, which obviously led to the expansion of the Champions League in the first place and the Super League, well, one of the decisions was this, that let's not forget, in a slightly different world, 2 Champions League positions would have been protected basically based on previous performance. So feasibly, high earning clubs in a recent history of the Champions League, they could have had exactly these seasons like United or Spurs, absolutely tanked and still made it into the Champions League. Now, there were some figures at UEFA that basically animated fans who were against that. The big clubs didn't get that. So what was the alternative solution? Well, essentially it's this. This is the safety net. This is the way you get back into the Champions League. You have an appalling season, but suddenly you're in a Europa League and there's much less competition because the Champions League clubs don't drop in. And hence suddenly, really, as they have been throughout the season, they're the 2 biggest clubs in the competition.
I mean, they are, and I hadn't realised it was quite as cynical as that. I never quite understood the opposition that some people had to the teams finishing third in the Champions League groups dropping into the Europa League. Why was that problematic? The Europa League has always been set up as a secondary competition. What it struck me as being very dangerous that by qualifying for Champions League, you're almost taking yourself out of contention for a trophy you could realistically win. Because there were some teams who are in the Champions League who you knew would never win it.
Yeah.
But they could have finished third in the group, get in the Europa League, then they have a chance of winning that. And I've been slightly baffled by the argument, particularly I think from Celtic fans, but from others as well, of, the new format's great for us because we're involved in it for longer. Yeah, but actually, this is no different.
Yeah.
This is actually worse. You get to play in the playoff and lose in that. But why is that better than finishing third in the Champions League, dropping into the Europa League, and having a chance of winning it? So you look at those teams who would have qualified. The teams basically ranked through 17 to 24 in the league. You'd have had City in there dropping into the Europa League. You'd have had Celtic. You'd have had Sporting.
Paris Saint-Germain.
Sorry?
Paris Saint-Germain.
No, they were 15th.
Oh, of course, yeah. They jumped up. Yeah.
Right. The idea that they somehow have had, if anything, have had less involvement because they haven't had the chance to do well in the Europa League. So anyway, Jack, what do you think about the clubs not dropping down anymore?
I think it's good. I was always against clubs dropping down. I think that if you get knocked out of Europe, you should be knocked out of Europe. Your passport should go back in the drawer until August of the next season. I think it's better. Maybe definitely the aggregate quality of teams in the Europa League might be improved by having those drop-down teams. I just think it adds to the sense of jeopardy in the Champions League not to have teams dropping down. And I think that in that sense, it kind of protects the Europa League a little bit. And I know that, maybe Man United and Tottenham are not the teams that some people would want to flourish in the Europa League. I think that it's better to have a Europa League which has that protection from super clubs having bad seasons.
Well, with that ferocious disagreement, let's go to a break. Me and Jack can fight that out in the car park. In the car park of the ferry port in Portsmouth. the ideal location for it. And we'll be back in part 2 to discuss the status of Europa League and what this final means for that. We'll see you then. Welcome back to Libero. This is the second half of our preview of the Europa League final. Tottenham against Manchester United. Two absolutely terrible Premier League clubs. Does it matter that it's an all-English affair, Miguel?
Yes. I think it's bad for European football. Generally, actually, I don't like one-country finals. I think it goes against the spirit, no matter where they're from. Obviously, there's this wider issue where, as we've discussed on the pod so much, the Premier League is this kind of international Super League. And while that isn't always going to be reflected in the Champions League because there are enough super clubs there, it's become an issue now, I think, in the Europa League. I mean, this is the second all-English final in the competitions in 6 years.
And there's 7 years. 7 seasons.
It's been a fairly regular...
6 years, 7 seasons.
Yeah. There's been a fairly regular presence. And I suppose the Europa League, and to pick up some of what we said in the last section about clubs dropping in, it should really be the trophy for those in that tier just underneath the elite that you can go for. And if that's going to be perpetually dictated again by the and there's a similar issue with the Conference League where I really, really don't like the fact that Big Five clubs drop into it or are in it at all. If it's going to be just dominated by the wealthy, that feels like it goes against what the Europa League has been the last few years.
Right, I'm playing devil's advocate here. I just to stress, I don't actually believe what I'm about to say. But what was the first ever UEFA Cup final once it stopped being the Fairs Cup?
Was that Leeds against Wolves or something like that?
Tottenham against Wolves.
Sorry, yeah, Tottenham.
So, 71-2. So Steve Perryman told me the story that Bill Nicholson had sort of said to the sort of wives and girlfriends who apparently were moaning that their husbands are going to be flying off all around Europe. He said, look, if we get to the final, I'll organise a special trip. All the wives and girlfriends can come. And then we'll go, we could get Vienna, we could get Milan, we could get Turin, we could get Setúbal. Who is it? Wolverhampton. Here's Bill Nicholson paying for a trip for your family to Wolverhampton. So the very first final was an all-English final. This will be the 11th final between two teams from the same country. And I think to an extent, not even to an extent, I think you can absolutely trace the power of who has the power in football through these finals. That you have, I think there's an old German final, late 70s.
Yeah.
I think De Cologne loses to Gladbach, I think. Then the late 80s, 90s, you get a lot of all Italian finals. All Spanish finals we've been used to. We had that all Portuguese final, absolutely awful game in Dublin. Yeah. And now we're seeing two all Premier League finals in fairly recent succession. So Miguel, my question is, why do you hate England? Why does it only bother you when it's English teams?
I think, if I may, the issue is not so. The issue isn't just the all English final, but like when Chelsea versus Arsenal in 2019, I think Chelsea and Arsenal finished 3rd and 5th in the Premier League that season. So, and lots, as you said, like lots of other countries have had finals, have produced 2 Europa League finalists in the same year. But I think only the Premier League and only the Premier League in 2025 could produce 2 finalists this bad. That's that's the issue. It's that we have this league of so much financial power that literally the two worst teams outside its relegation zone are nevertheless good enough to make the second biggest European final of the season.
Okay, so again, to play devil's advocate slightly, let's imagine that the Premier League table was determined exactly by payroll and you had the 4th and 5th bottom teams. So if this final was Nottingham Forest against Bournemouth, would that be a bad final?
Ultimately, I like.
I wouldn't like it either.
Yeah, I mean, a European final should be a club from one country against a club from another country, regardless of where they're from.
I actually thought Atalanta by Leverkusen last season. That's kind of a classic final.
Yeah.
Like you've got two you've got you've got two teams who I think have been really good over the last 2 years. Like obviously, Bayer Leverkusen were going for the treble that season. Atalanta hadn't won anything, but had obviously been a really good team consistently under Gasperini. They're both like historical clubs, but not giant clubs. Like Leverkusen come close to, had a great run in the Champions League like 20 years ago, but it's not like having a sort of Chelsea or Man United or even like an Atletico Madrid there. And but they're from two different countries, two very different, distinct playing styles, two great managers. I think that's almost the kind of ultimately the ultimate Europa League final, right?
I would go as far as to say last season was the perfect final. Even the venue was perfect. Dublin was exactly the right size.
Yeah.
That you being in Dublin the couple of days around that game, you felt sort of the buzz. Everybody's excited. You kept seeing Leverkusen fans or Atlanta fans. You'd go into cafes or bars. You'd hear people talking about the game. You'd see fans, locals talking to them. Dublin wanted to host it. Those two teams wanted to be there. The game itself did not go the way most people expected. I certainly didn't expect it to go that way.
Yeah.
Ademola Lookman produced an incredible performance, one of the great European final performances. And I can't think how you could have a better Europa League final in terms of just the status of everybody involved was just right.
Was that the best Europa League final you've ever been to?
I would say, yeah. Well, I have to say that Porto Celtic in 2003 was amazing. For different reasons. I mean, Seville couldn't cope. There's 100,000 Celtic fans went. The place, I think Bilbao won't be quite as bad as this, but there's clearly loads of Celtic fans just thought, it's Seville, it's hot, we'll just sleep on the streets. And you literally at night, you hardly walk down the street for sleeping Celtic fans. The phone network went down, nothing worked in the city. The stadium was miles out of town because it wasn't Sevilla's ground or Batista's ground, it was the Olympic Stadium. So it took ages to get there. Getting back was a nightmare. People kind of walking down this dual carriageway because you couldn't get taxis. There's no public transport. So everything was falling apart. But the game itself was apocalyptic and brilliant. So that was great. But in terms of just things feeling right and everything working, I'd say last season was the best. And last season was my 17th. This will be my 18th this year.
And on that exact point, though, actually, especially about the Atlanta game, I mean, Gasperini had a brilliant quote after the game that I find myself increasingly using a lot now, which is basically that it was a victory for meritocracy in football. It shows there can be a space for ideas, and it doesn't just have to be about money. And this season is the exact opposite of that. Because, I mean, essentially, the two clubs are here because they can pay. And I know this is amazing in the context of Spurs, but they can pay better wages than virtually every team they've played in the competition.
Spurs still had, up against Postecoglou, Spurs still had, they had Richarlison, who cost an initial 50 million. The front line was Richarlison, initial 50 million. Solanke, initial 55 million, and Brennan Johnson, I believe 47.5 million. So that's three players, all signed from Premier League clubs, all full internationals, combined transfer fee cost of 150 million quid. And they're up against Postecoglou, who are, an amazing story in many ways, but obviously not really equipped to compete with that kind of firepower. So you're right, Gasperini has been absolutely mudded. Gasperini's words have been thrown back in his face.
And what about the fact that you get, and this is obviously one of the reasons why United and Spurs have placed so much emphasis over the last couple of months on the Europa League. What about the fact that you do get Champions League football at the end of it? I mean, I've seen quite a lot of people in the last couple of weeks. The twin axis of Arsene Wenger and Richard Keys both seem very upset by this. Are we part of a Keys-Wenger axis?
Isn't this sort of basically a response to everything we've discussed over the last two pods? If obviously they can't do it with the FA Cup, but
why not?
Well, that's what they could, yeah, but they're not going to. And the Premier League would resist. The Premier League clubs would resist. This basically just imposes value in a competition that otherwise might not have some in the same way. That's the same. I mean, because again, look how much of the discussion around this final has been about what next, rather than just the glory of winning the FA or the old UEFA Cup.
So I think it's fair. I think it's fair enough.
Okay, go on then, Jack. On.
I think it's fair enough to have that as an added prize as well as the trophy, particularly given that I think the worst thing for the Europa League would be having teams who felt disincentivized to go for it. I think you really want teams who are maybe not from that kind of elite level or who don't have that same level of European experience. You want them to really treasure it. And I know, in an ideal world, the prestige alone would be enough. But I think in the material world that we live in, I think that adding that material incentive is good.
Nice use of a Wengerism to reply to Wenger in this world that we live in.
I just think I think it's fine. I thought those Wenger comments were a bit weird. I always wondered whether he was like, it was a bit of FIFA UEFA.
But it's I guess my question on this would be, I don't like clubs in a final in their own ground. So let's take Athletic out of this. But say this had been Lyon versus Glimt. Do we think that's a better final, Miguel?
Less people would watch it. I think that's probably fair to say.
It's one to have on in the background. You have it on in the background.
Right down to it. And that doesn't just apply to people in England.
Do a few tweets about it.
It would mean more. It would look. Well, would it mean more to both clubs? Like, to be fair, I've overlooked this a few times and I shouldn't. Winning would mean a huge amount to Tottenham, given everything.
Huge, absolutely huge.
It's not quite the same as for Manchester United, but I do think this actually feeds into something that's going to be really interesting dynamic in this final that I actually do think has tangible effect, which is the culture of winning. I mean, the very fact that United can kind of have this historically bad era, and yet they're still winning trophies. I mean, if they win Europa League, that's 3 in 3 years.
Yeah. I mean, before we get onto the game itself, and we should probably talk about that for 5 minutes at the end, I think the biggest argument against a Lyon Glimt final is having to read Rory writing for a third time on this little Norwegian team from the Arctic Circle. Like we can't be encouraging the sort of Smith Ames teams to do too well.
I just knew that the more that I read from Rory about Glimt, the more confident I was that they would wilt against the cold hard power of the Barclays. Yeah, I just knew that no broadsheet darlings like that are not going to survive up against a Premier League team.
The Smith of Death, as Miguel put it in our podcast. Anyway, so who do we? I mean, clearly Manchester United are going to win, aren't they, Mix?
So in pure football terms, I actually do think all stuff like that, like the kind of the history United that has an effect on games like this. In pure football terms, though, it's almost like a team without a midfield will play a team without a defence. Because both are basically probably going to have to play their second choice in those areas. Spurs are missing, not just 3 of their best midfielders, but 3 of the
3 best players this season.
Yeah, and United, who some of this run has been based on like at least some kind of structural stability at the back. They might have to play their second choice 3-man backline. So that could really accentuate a lot of this talk about being the worst final ever and desperation. If both teams are essentially trying to cover up their own flaws.
The thing is, the Spurs have beaten Man United 3 times this season, but in certainly like 2 of those 3 games, they've done so playing Ange ball. Like they've been very aggressive and assertive, and they've dominated possession. And they've had, but that's been completely dependent on Maddison and Kulusevski, who were brilliant in all 3 of those games. Contributed goals and assists each time. But now they don't have a midfield because there's no Maddison, no Kulusevski, almost certainly no Bergvall. I think they're going to have to stick with something close to the kind of Barclays ball that we've seen against Frankfurt and Glimt.
So what, the midfield's going to be Bentancur, Basuma and Sarr,
It'll be Bentancur, Basuma sitting, definitely, and then almost certainly Sarr. And, Sarr's like he makes good runs off the ball, he's got good energy, but he's not got a lot of quality in possession, I don't think. He doesn't really create chances with good passing and so on. So I think the only option probably is for them to play a similarly direct style. But the problem they'll have is that they can't lean on that physical individual superiority in the same way, because they'll be up against a team that also has lots of that.
And there is genuinely, with all of this as well, there is something about kind of, and I think this has been truer of Manchester United, because bizarrely, given a lot we said, Spurs' run to this final has been much colder than United's. They've taken like logical decisions based on the opposition, where it's almost, and I think this is genuinely influential in the final. United's has almost been about to like rising to the occasion of a European game. I mean, like you only have to look at the Lyon game. It doesn't make sense from any football perspective. You can't look at that in the way you can look at a lot of Tottenham's run to this final, even the Bilbao game to a certain degree. While I think the first leg performance against Bilbao was better than anything that Tottenham have produced in Europe this season. The second leg ended up being like just until they got that penalty. there was the ingredients there for another chaotic night at at Old Trafford, in the same way as the Lyon game. But I do think this kind of emotion of Europe can affect this final as well.
So you're saying United win, Miguel?
I think United win.
Jack?
I think with no midfield, it's going to be difficult for Spurs. So I'd say, yeah, I'd probably narrowly go for United.
Yeah, I think United will win. So with all of us saying that Postecoglou will be weeping off into the Bilbao sunset.
As Spurs fans play this back to us on Thursday morning, look at these wankers, all three of them going for not a hint that.
Yeah, I just can't. It's just so hard to imagine Tottenham winning stuff. It just doesn't make any sense.
Are we conditioned by that though?
Yeah, possibly.
Are we just psychologically conditioned by seeing Man United lift trophies and?
United lifting trophies while playing badly, in the same way that Germany used to. Right? Yeah. Germany won Euro '96, got the final World Cup in 2002, and it's like, but
yeah,
even England getting to the final of the last Euros without playing well at all. That to go back to one of our early episodes, club DNA, national DNA definitely exists. So with that, let's bring this to an end. Let's help the continuance of our DNA by rating, recommending, and particularly reviewing us. And we'll see you next time. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you then.